Long before emperors ruled from Cusco or stone roads crossed the mountains, the Andes imposed a problem no society could ignore: survival across extremes of altitude, climate, and seismic instability. The Andean region constitutes one of the most environmentally demanding landscapes ever occupied by complex human societies. Stretching over 7,000 kilometers along the western edge of South America, the Andes present sharp ecological contrasts within short horizontal distances. Elevation rises rapidly from coastal deserts to high mountain plateaus, producing a vertical environment in which temperature, rainfall, oxygen availability, and arable land vary dramatically within a few kilometers. This geography formed the primary constraint within which all Andean societies, including the Inca, were required to operate. Archaeologists commonly describe the Andes through a system of altitude zones rather than latitude. The Yunga zone, located on the eastern and western slopes, provided warmer climates suitable for coca, fruit, and maize cultivation. Above this lay the Quechua zone, between roughly 2,300 and 3,500 meters, which offered the most stable agricultural conditions and later supported dense populations. Beyond this threshold stretched the Puna, a high-altitude grassland where cold temperatures and thin air limited agriculture but supported camelid pastoralism. These zones were not isolated environments but interdependent components of a single economic system. Evidence from pollen analysis and sediment cores indicates that human communities were actively modifying Andean landscapes by at least 3000 BCE. Early terrace construction, irrigation channels, and soil retention walls appear in multiple regions, suggesting long-term experimentation with agricultural intensification. These adaptations were not designed to maximize surplus in a single zone but to mitigate environmental risk across multiple zones simultaneously. Crop failure at one altitude could be offset by production elsewhere, reducing vulnerability to drought, frost, or flooding. This strategy is often described by scholars as vertical complementarity. Rather than expanding outward across flat territory, Andean societies expanded upward and downward along mountain slopes. Archaeological surveys reveal settlement networks deliberately positioned to access different ecological niches. This pattern discouraged the early formation of large, centralized political units, as no single location controlled all necessary resources. Instead, cooperation, exchange, and kin-based networks became essential mechanisms of survival. Animal domestication followed similar ecological logic. Llamas and alpacas, adapted to high-altitude environments, provided meat, wool, and transport. Although llamas could not pull wheeled vehicles, they enabled reliable movement of goods across steep terrain. Zooarchaeological evidence from highland sites shows sustained camelid herding economies by the late 3rd millennium BCE. These animals underpinned long-distance exchange well before the emergence of state-level societies. The Andes are also among the most seismically active regions on Earth. Frequent earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity posed persistent risks to settlement stability. Archaeologists have identified repeated rebuilding phases at early Andean sites, indicating long-term adaptation rather than abandonment. Over time, architectural practices evolved to emphasize stone masonry, flexible wall joints, and low center of gravity structures, features later perfected by the Inca but rooted in much earlier experimentation. Climate variability further shaped Andean adaptation. Periodic disruptions associated with El Niño, Southern Oscillation events, caused alternating cycles of drought and flooding along the coast and highlands. Paleoclimatic data suggest that societies capable of managing surplus storage and regional exchange were more resilient to these fluctuations. Archaeological remains of early storage facilities indicate that food security mechanisms were in place millennia before imperial administration. These environmental conditions produced a distinctive relationship between geography and political organization. The Andes did not favor rapid territorial expansion or centralized control based on contiguous farmland. Instead, they encouraged decentralized systems connected by exchange routes, seasonal movement, and reciprocal labor obligations. Political authority, where it emerged, was often negotiated rather than imposed, relying on the coordination of dispersed communities rather than direct domination. By the late 1st millennium BCE, The Andes already supported interconnected societies capable of large-scale coordination despite environmental constraints. These foundational adaptations, ecological, agricultural, and architectural, established the conditions under which more centralized political systems could eventually emerge. These ecological constraints shaped the earliest Andean societies long before the Inca emerged. Before continuing, viewers who wish to support this channel can subscribe to Nightfall History and enable notifications for future nightly documentaries. If any section proves especially informative, feel free to note it in the comments below. Engagement helps sustain the production of long-form, research-driven historical content. The Inca did not emerge in a vacuum. They inherited an Andean world already shaped by millennia of organized settlements, religious institutions, and complex governance. By 3000 BCE, the coastal and highland regions of the Andes supported some of the earliest known urban and ceremonial centers in the Americas. The Carol civilization, located in the Soup Valley, exemplifies this early organizational capacity. Archaeologists have uncovered massive platform mounds, sunken plazas, and sophisticated irrigation systems, indicating coordinated labor and long-term settlement planning. Pyramidal structures suggest communal ceremonial activity, while the arrangement of residential areas reflects early forms of social hierarchy. These features demonstrate that urban complexity preceded monumental stone construction and the highland empire that would later be associated with the Inca. Several centuries later, the Chavan culture, c. 900 to 200 BCE, emerged in the northern highlands of present-day Peru. Chavan's significance lies in its ideological and religious influence. Temple complexes at Chavan de Huántar feature intricate stone carvings, subterranean galleries, and iconography of jaguars, felines, and serpentine motifs. These symbols would permeate Andean artistic traditions for centuries. Archaeological evidence, including trade of exotic materials such as spondylus shells, demonstrates early integration of long-distance exchange networks, foreshadowing the logistical sophistication of later Inca administration. In coastal regions, the Moche, c. 100 to 800 CE, and Nazca, c. 100 BCE, 800 CE, societies further developed urban and ritual infrastructure. Moche centers, such as Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, reveal highly organized labor systems, complex irrigation canals, and elite tombs with rich iconographic decoration. The Nazca are noted for their ceremonial centers, subterranean aqueducts, puquios, and the famed geoglyphs, which, though symbolic, required coordinated planning over extensive geographic areas. These societies display administrative, religious, and engineering capacities that created models for later highland state formation. The highland civilizations of Tawantinsuyu, c. 300 to 1000 CE, and the Wari, c. 600 to 1000 CE, provide more direct structural precedents for Inca governance. Tawantinsuyu, located near Lake Titicaca, demonstrates sophisticated urban planning with monumental stone architecture, raised fields for agriculture, and standardized construction techniques. Archaeological surveys indicate regional colonies and trade hubs, reflecting centralized oversight of distant communities. Similarly, the Wari Empire established extensive road networks, administrative centers, and standardized building layouts, particularly in highland valleys. Inscriptions, ceramics, and settlement patterns indicate a bureaucratic approach to governance that closely resembles later Inca practices in resource allocation, labor mobilization, and provincial control. Across these pre-Inca civilizations, several patterns emerge that would influence the Inca state. First, ceremonial and religious centers served as focal points for both social cohesion and political authority. Second, infrastructural development, including roads, canals, and terraces, demonstrated the ability to coordinate large-scale labor across varied ecological zones. Third, regional exchange networks and administrative strategies allowed populations to survive environmental challenges while maintaining centralized oversight. These elements collectively provided a structural template that the Inca would later refine into an integrated imperial system. By the end of the first millennium CE, Andean societies were interconnected, territorially organized, and capable of supporting large populations across diverse ecological zones. From these traditions emerged the regional societies of the Cusco Valley, which would form the nucleus of the later Inca Empire. Before the Inca became rulers of Tawantinsuyu, Cusco was one among many competing settlements, its valleys dotted with small communities negotiating survival in a challenging highland landscape. Between approximately 1000 and 1200 CE, the Cusco Valley was characterized by a network of small, kin-based polities rather than a centralized state. Archaeological evidence from the region indicates that these communities were closely tied to local ecological conditions, managing terraces, irrigation channels, and valley soils to maximize agricultural productivity. Settlement patterns, inferred from excavation layers and survey data, show that population growth was gradual and distributed across multiple sites, suggesting cooperative adaptation rather than sudden urbanization or conquest. Excavations of Kilca-phase ceramics, distinctive blackware pottery with geometric motifs, provide a reliable chronological marker for the pre-Inca occupation of the Cusco Valley. These artifacts are often found alongside remains of domestic structures, storage facilities, and small defensive walls, demonstrating a combination of subsistence farming, resource storage, and localized conflict preparedness. This material culture reflects continuity with broader Andean traditions, including earlier Wari and Tawantinsuyu administrative techniques, but adapted to the scale and ecology of the valley. The political organization of the Cusco Valley at this time relied heavily on kinship networks and lineage groups. Leadership was generally inherited within clans, with authority distributed across multiple family heads rather than centralized in a single ruler. Ethno-historical accounts recorded by chroniclers such as Garcilaso de la Vega suggest that these early leaders mediated disputes, coordinated labor for terraces and irrigation, and maintained alliances through marriage and reciprocal obligations. Archaeological evidence corroborates this, showing patterns of shared workspaces and communal construction consistent with a collective decision-making model. Agricultural competition among these small polities further shaped the valley's social and political landscape. Limited arable land in the Quechua zone necessitated careful allocation of terraces and pastures, encouraging negotiation and cooperative agreements between neighboring settlements. Pollen studies and soil analyses indicate that maize, potatoes, and quinoa were the dominant staples, with camelids providing meat, wool, and transportation. This diversified subsistence strategy allowed communities to withstand environmental fluctuations, including seasonal frost and variable rainfall, while creating incentives for inter-settlement trade and labor exchange. Settlement morphology also suggests early defensive considerations. Stone foundations, low walls, and strategically positioned dwellings indicate awareness of interpolity conflict. These structures were not large fortresses but rather localized measures to protect resources and maintain social cohesion. The evidence points to a landscape of dynamic interaction, where alliances and rivalries coexisted, setting the stage for the emergence of a more centralized authority. By the late 12th century, these conditions, population density, resource management expertise, and localized political structures, created an environment in which a single lineage could begin to assert dominance. These conditions set the stage for the emergence of a ruling lineage, which would ultimately evolve into the foundation of the Inca state that in the highlands of Cusco. Stories of sun-born founders and mysterious siblings were more than legend. They were the framework through which emerging leaders asserted authority. The earliest accounts of Inca origins survive primarily through post-conquest chronicles, recorded by Spanish observers such as Garcilaso de la Vega and Juan de Betanzos. These sources describe foundational figures like Manco Capac, the first Sapa Inca, and the Ayer siblings, who emerged from the mythical cave of Pacaratambo. While these narratives are often framed in supernatural terms, modern scholarship treats them as political memory, encoding genealogical claims, territorial legitimacy, and social hierarchy rather than literal history. Archaeological evidence to directly verify these stories remains sparse, indicating that memory and ritual, rather than material monuments, were central to early Inca identity. Garcilaso de la Vega, writing in the early 17th century, emphasizes continuity between Cusco's early rulers and the divine mandate of the sun. He portrays Manco Capac as both a spiritual figure and a practical leader, who established initial settlements and delineated territory. Betanzos, meanwhile, provides detailed accounts of kinship structures, leadership succession, and alliances between clans. Cross-referencing these narratives with archaeological layers from the Quilca phase demonstrates that settlements in the Cusco Valley were expanding gradually during this period, suggesting that the Inca lineage leveraged pre-existing communities rather than imposing new settlements abruptly. The symbolism embedded in Inca origin myths also served practical political functions. By claiming descent from the sun god Inti, early leaders justified territorial claims and centralized authority in an environment dominated by kin-based polities. These myths were regularly reinforced through ritual, including offerings at sacred sites and ceremonies within Cusco, which archaeological evidence indicates were in use by at least the 12th century. Structures such as early plazas and ritual enclosures suggest that ceremonial organization preceded formal imperial administration. Interpretive analysis indicates that myth and memory were strategic tools. Rather than purely spiritual constructs, they facilitated social cohesion and provided a framework for conflict resolution. By embedding leadership claims within shared narrative, early rulers could consolidate loyalty among dispersed kin groups and coordinate cooperative labor, which was essential for terrace construction, irrigation maintenance, and regional defense. This demonstrates that ideological legitimacy was as important as physical control during the initial phase of Inca consolidation. Evidence from ceramic patterns, settlement distribution, and burial practices further supports the distinction between symbolic authority and practical governance. Early Inca leaders were able to mobilize labor and resources through a combination of ritual obligation and reciprocal kinship agreements. The alignment of ceremonial sites along ecological zones indicates that political strategy was closely intertwined with environmental management, a pattern observed in prior Andean polities like Wari and Tawantinsuyu. While the supernatural elements of these stories cannot be confirmed archaeologically, the structural outcomes, plaza organization, terraced agriculture, and coordinated labor, demonstrate that early Inca leaders translated myth into actionable governance. Mythological authority soon translated into territorial control, laying the groundwork for the expansion and state formation that would characterize the empire in the following centuries. Expansion began not with conquest, but consolidation. The early Inca rulers focused first on securing their immediate environment before extending influence across the Cusco Valley. Between approximately 1200 and 1350 CE, the Cusco Valley experienced a period of gradual territorial consolidation under emerging Inca leadership. Archaeological evidence indicates that this era was characterized by small-scale defensive expansion, strategic alliances, and controlled redistribution of land among kinship groups. Rather than seeking immediate regional domination, early rulers concentrated on stabilizing their core territory, ensuring reliable agricultural production, and strengthening loyalty among local lineages. Excavations in and around Cusco reveal the presence of early fortifications, including low walls and defensive terraces, which suggest a focus on protecting resources and settlements from rival polities. These fortifications were not extensive military installations but were sufficient to deter raids and maintain control over strategic agricultural zones. The design and placement of these structures demonstrate careful planning and knowledge of both terrain and resource distribution. Concurrently, archaeological surveys and ceramic analyses indicate systematic settlement reorganization. Residential patterns were adjusted to consolidate allied kin groups, optimize access to arable land, and enhance surveillance over key routes. Evidence from Quilca phase pottery suggests that this reorganization coincided with increased population density within central Cusco, reflecting the growing importance of the valley as a political nucleus. Land redistribution was a central element of early consolidation. Agricultural terraces and associated irrigation channels were reallocated among different kin-based groups, ensuring that key supporters maintained access to vital resources. Documents recorded in early Spanish chronicles, including references to the redistribution of fields and labor obligations, support the existence of a regulated system in which authority was reinforced through both tangible and social means. Alliance building was also a crucial strategy. Leaders negotiated marriages, labor exchange agreements, and ritual obligations with neighboring communities. Archaeological evidence of coordinated construction projects, shared plazas, and communal storage facilities indicates that these alliances were both practical and ceremonial. Control over these networks allowed the early Inca to extend influence beyond their immediate settlements without requiring direct conquest. Infrastructure improvements further facilitated consolidation. The construction and maintenance of terraces, storage facilities, and pathways enabled efficient management of agricultural surplus and resource distribution. This logistical capacity provided the means to support population growth, mitigate environmental risk, and assert the authority of central leadership over a dispersed valley population. Records of early plazas and ceremonial structures indicate that public ritual was also integrated into political consolidation. Central spaces served multiple functions: venues for formal gatherings, redistribution of surplus, and reinforcement of social hierarchy. These ceremonial sites strengthened political cohesion while asserting the authority of emerging leaders in tangible ways. By the end of this period, Cusco had evolved into a well-organized valley polity. Defensive measures, administrative reorganization, land management, and alliance networks collectively established a foundation upon which future territorial expansion could be built. Political authority required new forms of administration, as the Inca prepared to extend influence beyond the immediate valley and lay the groundwork for broader imperial ambitions. Social organization became the empire's first infrastructure. Before roads and fortresses, it was kinship, obligation, and coordinated labor that allowed the Inca to govern effectively. By the mid-13th century, the Inca had begun to formalize social and administrative structures that would underpin their future empire. Central to this system was the Ayllu, a kin-based social unit that integrated families into cooperative networks for agricultural production, labor allocation, and ritual participation. Each Ayllu was responsible for the management of specific land plots, terraces, and communal resources, creating a stable framework for resource distribution and social cohesion. Archaeological surveys in the Cusco Valley indicate that residential clusters and associated terraces were organized to reflect Ayllu membership, allowing leaders to coordinate work efficiently across households. The principle of reciprocal labor, known as Ani, structured cooperation within and between Ayllus. Members contributed labor to communal projects, such as irrigation maintenance, terrace construction, and storage management, with the expectation of equivalent support in return. This system reinforced mutual obligation while enabling leaders to mobilize labor without relying on coercion. Early storage facilities, terraces, and communal construction evidenced the practical application of Ani, showing that coordinated effort was central to sustaining both agricultural output and political authority. Alongside the Ayllu system, emerging elite structures began to differentiate leadership roles within the valley. Certain lineages exercised authority over multiple Ayllus, coordinating labor, adjudicating disputes, and representing collective interests in alliances with neighboring settlements. Spanish chroniclers described these leaders as intermediaries between ordinary households and the emerging Sapa Inca authority, illustrating the early formation of hierarchical governance. Archaeological indicators, including differentiated housing, ceremonial plazas, and controlled access to resources, corroborate these textual accounts, demonstrating tangible markers of social stratification. Religious and ritual practice was tightly intertwined with governance. Leaders organized ceremonies and offerings to local deities and ancestors, reinforcing social bonds while legitimizing authority. Central plazas and ritual structures, excavated in Cusco, provide evidence that ceremonial coordination was a key tool in consolidating loyalty and integrating dispersed communities under common norms. This combination of social, economic, and religious obligation created a cohesive framework that bound population, territory, and labor together. The Ayllu and Ani systems also functioned as mechanisms of risk management. By coordinating labor and redistributing surplus, communities could buffer against environmental variability, such as frost, drought, or floods. Archaeological studies of storage facilities and terracing demonstrate careful planning that balanced production across households and ecological zones. These adaptive strategies allowed early leaders to secure sufficient resources while maintaining legitimacy and social stability. Infrastructure for coordination extended beyond households. Early pathways, Minor roads and communication networks enabled ALU leaders to oversee labor contributions, monitor agricultural output, and facilitate redistribution. These logistical channels, though modest compared to later imperial roads, illustrate the integration of social organization and territorial management. This system created a scalable model in which authority could expand without immediate military conquest. Records from early Spanish chroniclers further indicate that loyalty was enforced through a combination of obligation, ritual, and interdependence. Labor contributions were both a duty and a form of social insurance. Households relied on each other for mutual support, while leaders relied on coordinated effort to sustain central authority. The institutionalization of these reciprocal obligations ensured that governance extended across multiple ecological and social zones, establishing continuity and predictability within the valley. By consolidating the ALU system, formalizing reciprocal labor, and establishing elite coordination, the early Inca created a framework capable of supporting complex administration. These structures provided the organizational foundation for expansion, allowing the emerging state to mobilize resources, integrate newly acquired territories, and project authority efficiently across the Cusco Valley. These institutions enabled rapid territorial expansion, setting the stage for the transformation from a regional polity into the extensive Andean Empire that would dominate centuries later. Empire began as reform, not conquest. Pachacuti did not first march armies across the highlands. He first reshaped the very structures of power within Cusco. Pachacuti, traditionally dated to have ruled from approximately 1438 to 1471 CE, is widely credited with transforming the Inca polity from a regional kingdom into an imperial authority. Archaeological, architectural, and ethno-historical evidence indicates that his approach combined administrative innovation, urban reorganization, and ideological consolidation. Rather than relying solely on military conquest, Pachacuti focused on centralizing governance, integrating disparate kin-based communities, and standardizing ceremonial practices to project authority across the Cusco Valley. Urban reconstruction was a central component of Pachacuti's strategy. Cusco, previously a collection of loosely organized settlements, was reorganized into a planned urban center with a radial layout oriented along major axes connecting four suyus, the future administrative divisions of Tawantinsuyu. Excavations in Cusco reveal the construction of terraces, plazas, and elite residences that formalized spatial hierarchies, supporting both political authority and ritual practice. Machu Picchu, though located outside the Central Valley, reflects similar architectural principles and demonstrates the reach of state planning, with terraces, water channels, and administrative structures integrating local ecology into centralized control. Military reforms under Pachacuti were equally consequential. Spanish chroniclers describe systematic conscription through the Mitma and Mitmacuna systems, which relocated populations to reinforce strategic territories and secure newly conquered regions. Archaeological evidence, including fortifications at Ollantaytambo and Paisac, shows that these defensive measures complemented offensive campaigns, allowing Pachacuti to project power efficiently while stabilizing border regions. Military organization emphasized not only manpower but also logistical coordination, enabling campaigns across diverse ecological zones. Administrative centralization involved both territorial and social restructuring. Pachacuti instituted a hierarchical system of governance linking provincial leaders to Cusco. This structure relied on the ALU system for labor mobilization, with elite lineages responsible for maintaining infrastructure, collecting tribute, and overseeing local production. Ceremonial obligations reinforced these connections, as centralized rituals at Cusco symbolically and materially integrated peripheral communities into imperial networks. Archaeological sites across the highlands indicate the construction of administrative centers, storage facilities, and plazas designed to support these functions. Ideological transformation accompanied structural reforms. Pachacuti elevated the cult of Inti and reinforced the Sapa Inca's divine status, using ritual, architecture, and iconography to legitimize centralized authority. Plaza layouts, ceremonial platforms, and religious iconography, including carved stones and gold artifacts, reflect a deliberate emphasis on state ideology. These measures created a unifying narrative that facilitated the integration of diverse peoples under a single imperial identity, while preserving local practices through controlled syncretism. Infrastructure expansion was a critical mechanism for maintaining cohesion. The development of road networks and suspension bridges enabled communication, rapid troop movement, and the transport of goods. Archaeological surveys along the Kapaknan reveal engineering adaptations to high-altitude environments, including drainage systems, retaining walls, and steps carved into cliffs. These projects were closely tied to labor obligations and the MITA system, linking population management with state capacity and consolidating Pachacutic's authority across both central and peripheral regions. Economic reorganization complemented these efforts. Centralized storage facilities and redistribution networks allowed Cusco to control agricultural surpluses, coordinate labor across ecological zones, and provide logistical support for military and ceremonial activities. Archaeological evidence from grain silos and terraced farms indicates careful planning and a capacity for long-term resource management. These systems reinforced the social hierarchy, ensuring that elite control was supported by tangible administrative mechanisms rather than solely by symbolic authority. Records indicate that Pachacutic's reign involved both diplomacy and strategic incorporation of conquered polities. Micmac resettlement policies redistributed populations to reduce rebellion potential, integrate labor forces, and ensure loyalty to Cusco. Material culture, including standardized ceramics and architectural forms in annexed territories, reflects deliberate cultural integration. These policies minimized resistance while maintaining regional productivity, demonstrating the combination of coercion, negotiation, and administration that characterized early imperial consolidation. By the end of Pachacutic's reign, Cusco had been transformed from a regional hub into a centralized capital capable of sustaining a growing empire. Urban planning, military organization, administrative hierarchy, ideological centralization, and infrastructure development collectively established the foundations of the Inca state. Archaeological evidence from both Cusco and Machu Picchu corroborates the scale and sophistication of these reforms, illustrating a deliberate process of systemic consolidation rather than spontaneous conquest. Administrative restructuring allowed sustained expansion, providing the Inca with the organizational capacity to extend authority across the Andean highlands and integrate diverse ecological and social zones into a functioning empire. The Inca expanded faster than any Andean power before them. Mountains, rivers, and valleys that had once separated polities became corridors of imperial integration. Following the consolidation of Cusco under Pachacuti, the Inca initiated systematic territorial expansion across the Andean highlands. Campaigns extended north into present-day Ecuador, south into Bolivia, and west toward northern Chile, encompassing a remarkable diversity of ecological zones and pre-existing polities. Archaeological evidence, including fortifications, administrative centers, and standardized architectural forms, demonstrates the strategic, multifaceted approach the Inca employed to incorporate new territories. Northern expansion into the highlands of Ecuador involved both military campaigns and alliances with local chiefdoms. Sites such as Cochaski exhibit architectural patterns consistent with Inca influence, including large ceremonial platforms and evidence of centralized storage. Chroniclers describe the incorporation of local elites through marriage, tribute arrangements, and recognition of pre-existing leadership, allowing for continuity of governance while asserting Cusco's authority. Population resettlement Micmac redistributed communities to secure borders, integrate labor, and reduce the potential for rebellion, as corroborated by archaeological settlement patterns in annexed valleys. Southward expansion into modern-day Bolivia focused on the high-altitude Altiplano, where Tawantinsuyu cultural remnants had historically dominated. The Inca constructed administrative centers and fortified settlements along strategic routes, demonstrating the use of infrastructure to consolidate territorial control. Terrace farming and storage facilities were extended into newly conquered valleys, enabling Cusco to manage agricultural surplus across challenging terrain. Excavations of road networks connecting these regions reveal careful engineering to maintain communication and logistical support over long distances. Western campaigns toward northern Chile and the Atacama Corridor were similarly strategic. These regions, often semi-arid and sparsely populated, required adaptation to local environmental conditions. Inca engineers expanded existing irrigation systems, established small settlements along trade routes, and integrated local labor into the imperial economy. Archaeological survey data suggest that the Inca avoided large-scale displacement, instead using population redistribution selectively to secure critical corridors while respecting existing local communities. Diplomatic incorporation was as important as military conquest. In addition to the relocation of populations, the Inca implemented systems of tribute and labor obligations that tied newly incorporated communities to Cusco. Spanish chroniclers note that conquered polities were often allowed to maintain traditional religious practices and local leadership structures, provided they contributed labor, resources, and military support. Archaeological evidence of standardized storehouses, kulkas, roads, and plazas indicates the effective implementation of these policies, facilitating administrative oversight without the constant presence of imperial troops. Infrastructure development was integral to sustained expansion. The Kapaknan road system, extending thousands of kilometers, connected highland and coastal zones, enabling rapid movement of armies, officials, and goods. Construction techniques adapted to ecological challenges. Suspension bridges spanned gorges, retaining walls stabilized mountain passes, and drainage systems mitigated seasonal rainfall. These networks allowed Cusco to project authority across geographically fragmented regions, ensuring that expansion was accompanied by functional control rather than symbolic domination alone. Administrative coordination was reinforced by the replication of urban and ceremonial models. In newly incorporated regions, plazas, storage facilities, and elite residences were constructed following standardized architectural patterns observed in Cusco. This created visual and functional markers of Inca authority, facilitating integration while promoting a sense of imperial unity. Material culture, including ceramics and textiles, was also standardized, supporting both economic and ideological cohesion. Military organization complemented these strategies. Garrisons were established at key points along expansion corridors, often adjacent to administrative centers. These installations provided rapid response capability, protected supply lines, and reinforced local compliance with tribute and labor obligations. Excavations at fortified sites in the northern and southern highlands show that defensive architecture was integrated into settlement planning, combining both logistical and strategic objectives. The combination of diplomacy, infrastructure, and military presence allowed the Inca to extend influence across the Andes in a remarkably short period. Unlike earlier highland polities, which expanded sporadically and relied heavily on coercion, the Inca integrated ecological adaptation, logistical planning, and social management into territorial strategy. This systemic approach ensured that conquest translated into long-term control rather than temporary occupation. Expansion required administrative standardization, as dispersed populations and varied ecological zones demanded consistent governance mechanisms to sustain imperial authority over vast and complex territories. Control depended on information, not writing. The Inca maintained authority through meticulous record-keeping, census data, and administrative oversight rather than a written script. As the Inca Empire expanded across the Andes, a sophisticated system of provincial administration became essential to manage diverse populations and ecological zones. The empire was divided into 4 suyus: Chinchaysuyu to the northwest, Antisuyu to the northeast, Calasuyu to the southeast, and Conquistadors to the southwest, each radiating from Cusco, the imperial center. This quadripartite organization not only reflected geographic logic but also facilitated governance, resource allocation, and military coordination across thousands of kilometers of highland and coastal territory. Each suyu was administered by a governor or apukuna, who reported directly to the Sapa Inca. These provincial governors oversaw local ailis, coordinated labor obligations, and ensured that tribute in the form of agricultural produce, textiles, and other resources was collected and transported to central storage facilities. Archaeological evidence, including standardized administrative centers, storage structures, and plaza layouts, demonstrates the systematic implementation of governance across diverse regions. These centers served as both logistical hubs and symbols of imperial authority, reinforcing Cusco's reach into distant territories. Accurate knowledge of population and resources was fundamental to imperial control. The Inca conducted regular censuses, recording households, labor capacity, and land tenure. Data were maintained through quipu, a system of knotted cords that encoded numerical and categorical information. Archaeologists have documented surviving quipu fragments and accounts in Spanish chronicles, indicating their use for taxation, labor obligations, and military conscription. By relying on quipu, the Inca could coordinate large-scale projects, mobilize labor efficiently, and respond to environmental or political challenges without a written language. Provincial administration also relied on a hierarchy of intermediary officials to bridge the gap between central authority and local communities. These officials managed labor rotations, supervised agricultural production, and implemented ritual obligations that reinforced loyalty to the empire. Infrastructural investments, including roads, storage facilities, and plazas, were maintained under their supervision, ensuring that logistical and ceremonial needs were continuously met. Archaeological surveys across the highlands and coastal valleys reveal uniformity in administrative architecture, suggesting centralized standards applied across culturally and ecologically diverse regions. Integration of conquered territories required flexibility within the administrative framework. Local elites were often retained to manage ALIS and serve as intermediaries, provided they adhered to imperial regulations and contributed labor and tribute. This pragmatic approach minimized resistance while maintaining continuity in local governance structures. Evidence from regional centers indicates that architectural and material culture often combined traditional local styles with standardized Inca patterns, reflecting both accommodation and imperial oversight. Labor organization was a central function of provincial governance. Through the MITA system, communities contributed labor for agriculture, infrastructure, military service, and ceremonial projects. Provincial officials coordinated schedules, ensured equitable distribution of work, and monitored compliance. Excavations of terraces, roads, bridges, and storage centers indicate the scale and precision of labor mobilization, demonstrating that administrative control extended from Cusco to the most remote highland valleys. Tribute management was similarly structured. Resources collected from provincial populations were recorded in quipu, stored in centralized facilities, and redistributed according to imperial priorities. Granaries, storehouses, and ceremonial centers functioned as both economic and administrative nodes, linking production with consumption and ritual obligations. Archaeological evidence of these facilities demonstrates careful planning to support both local needs and central authority, facilitating long-distance coordination across challenging terrain. Ceremonial and ideological practices were integrated into governance to reinforce loyalty. Provincial governors oversaw rituals that mirrored those conducted in Cusco, ensuring consistency of imperial ideology. Public plazas and ceremonial platforms were central to this process, functioning as spaces for tribute collection, labor mobilization, and community engagement. The replication of these sites across provinces reflected the standardization of administrative and ideological systems, creating a sense of cohesion despite ecological and cultural diversity. Communication and logistics were supported by the Capac-Nan road system, connecting provincial centers with Cusco and facilitating rapid transmission of information, personnel, and goods. Strategic way stations, bridges, and stairways enabled officials to monitor compliance, deliver supplies, and conduct inspections efficiently. The integration of physical infrastructure with bureaucratic systems exemplifies the Inca approach to governance. Information, labor, and logistics were tightly interlinked. By combining census data, quipu accounting, hierarchical administration, and infrastructure, the Inca maintained centralized control over a vast and diverse empire. This system allowed Cusco to exercise authority across ecological zones, integrate conquered populations, and coordinate large-scale economic and ceremonial activities. Provincial administration functioned as both a practical mechanism for governance and a symbolic affirmation of imperial power, linking local communities to the broader structure of the state. Administration supported a complex economy, providing the organizational capacity to mobilize labor, manage production, and sustain the logistical networks necessary for both urban centers and expansive agricultural and ceremonial projects throughout the empire. The empire was fed by engineering. Across steep mountainsides and high-altitude plains, the Inca reshaped landscapes to sustain millions. Agriculture formed the backbone of the Inca Empire, supporting both population growth and state expansion. The empire's success relied on a combination of terracing, irrigation, and crop diversification to manage the challenges posed by steep slopes, variable climates, and high-altitude environments. Archaeological evidence from terrace systems across the Cusco Valley and Andean highlands demonstrates sophisticated engineering designed to maximize arable land while preventing erosion and conserving water. Terraces, often reinforced with stone retaining walls, created microclimates that stabilized temperature, increased soil depth, and allowed cultivation in regions otherwise unsuitable for farming. Water management was equally critical. Irrigation channels, reservoirs, and canals distributed water efficiently across terraces, controlling seasonal variability and ensuring consistent yields. Sites such as Moray and Taipan exhibit advanced hydraulic engineering, with terraces designed to manage runoff and regulate microclimates for experimental cultivation. Archaeological studies indicate that these systems were often coordinated at the provincial level, with labor mobilized through the MITA system to maintain and expand infrastructure. Crop selection was adapted to altitude, soil type, and climatic variability. Maize was cultivated at lower Quechua zones, providing staple food and ceremonial resources, while potatoes thrived in higher Puna regions. Quinoa, legumes, and other tubers supplemented the diet, reflecting a diversified strategy to mitigate risk from environmental fluctuations, including frost and drought. Pollen analysis and soil studies demonstrate deliberate planting sequences and intercropping techniques that optimized yield and resilience across ecological zones. Food security depended not only on production but also on storage. The construction of kulkas, or storage facilities, allowed surplus crops to be preserved for redistribution during shortages or ceremonial events. Archaeological evidence from Cusco, the Sacred Valley, and peripheral provinces shows that these storehouses were strategically located near roads and central plazas, enabling efficient transport and management. Some facilities were designed with ventilation and drainage systems, indicating attention to long-term preservation under variable environmental conditions. Terracing and irrigation also facilitated regional specialization. Different valleys and ecological zones focused on crops most suited to their environment, creating interdependent production networks. For example, high-altitude areas produced potatoes and camelid pasture. Mid-altitude zones focused on maize and tubers, and lower valleys contributed coca, maize, and cotton. Surplus products were transported along the Capac Nan to supply Cusco, military garrisons, and other administrative centers, reinforcing the empire's capacity for central oversight and logistical coordination. Labor mobilization through the MITA system was essential to sustain these agricultural systems. Households contributed periodic labor for terrace construction, irrigation maintenance, and harvest management. Administrative officials coordinated labor rotations, ensuring equitable distribution of obligations and maintaining productivity across both central and peripheral regions. Excavated terraces and associated infrastructure indicate consistent maintenance and expansion over centuries, illustrating the long-term commitment required to support population growth and imperial demands. Agricultural engineering also mitigated ecological risk. Terraces prevented landslides and soil erosion, while irrigation systems regulated water flow in areas prone to drought or heavy rainfall. Experimental terrace complexes such as Moray suggest that the Inca actively tested microclimates for crop optimization, demonstrating a deliberate scientific approach to agricultural adaptation. This capacity to manipulate local environments enabled the empire to sustain large populations in otherwise challenging conditions. Ceremonial and political considerations were closely tied to food production. Agricultural surpluses funded festivals, feasts, and state-sponsored labor projects, reinforcing social cohesion and imperial authority. Storage and redistribution were coordinated to align with ritual cycles, ensuring that food security supported both economic stability and ideological legitimacy. Archaeological evidence of granaries, ceremonial plazas, and road networks confirms the integration of production, storage, and ceremonial logistics. The scale and organization of Inca agriculture represent a complex, empire-wide system combining engineering, labor management, and ecological knowledge. Terracing, irrigation, diversified crop strategies, and storage networks collectively ensured that the empire could feed urban populations, military garrisons, and labor forces engaged in construction and administration. These systems also allowed for regional specialization and interdependence, forming the foundation of a resilient and centralized economy. Surplus enabled specialization, allowing artisans, administrators, and laborers to focus on non-agricultural production, infrastructure development, and state projects, forming the basis of the empire's broader economic and social complexity. Wealth was measured in labor, not currency. The Inca state mobilized human effort as the primary resource, directing it toward agriculture, infrastructure, and imperial administration. The Inca economy relied heavily on labor taxation, known as the MITA, a system that organized population labor contributions for state projects. Unlike monetary systems, wealth in the empire was quantified through the ability of households to provide labor for agriculture, road construction, storage maintenance, and military service. Records from early Spanish chroniclers, along with archaeological evidence, indicate that MITA obligations were systematically allocated by ALU and coordinated by provincial officials to ensure equitable distribution and consistent productivity. State-managed storehouses, kulkas, were central to the redistribution of resources produced through MITA labor. These facilities, often located at strategic points along major roads and near administrative centers, held agricultural surpluses, textiles, and other essential goods. The granaries were engineered for long-term preservation, incorporating ventilation shafts, drainage channels, and elevated platforms to protect against moisture and pests. Evidence from Cusco, the Sacred Valley, and other provincial centers shows that storehouse networks were extensive, allowing centralized authorities to manage food security and supply labor forces during periods of seasonal scarcity or environmental stress. Labor contributions under the MITA system were rotated to maintain agricultural productivity, while providing the workforce necessary for large-scale state projects. Households were assigned specific duties according to capacity, seasonal requirements, and ecological conditions. Excavated terraces, road segments, and irrigation systems demonstrate the scale of coordinated labor, while distribution patterns of storage facilities indicate the careful logistical planning required to sustain these operations. Labor taxation was not only a tool for production but also a mechanism for integrating communities into imperial administration. Redistribution served multiple purposes. Surpluses stored in kulkas were used to support urban populations, ceremonial activities, and military garrisons. Food and materials could be transported along the Capac Nan, enabling Cusco to maintain logistical oversight over distant provinces. This system ensured that labor contributions translated into tangible benefits for both the state and local communities, reinforcing loyalty and social cohesion. Archaeological evidence of transport routes, storage hubs, and associated administrative centers illustrates the efficiency and reach of these redistribution networks. In addition to agricultural labor, MITA obligations extended to construction projects. Road building, suspension bridges, fortifications, and terraces were all completed through coordinated workforce mobilization. Sites such as Ollantaytambo, Taipan, and Machu Picchu reveal careful planning and execution, with labor organized to optimize both engineering outcomes and workforce management. Provincial officials oversaw schedules, allocated tools, and maintained records through Quipu, ensuring that labor and material resources were accounted for and effectively deployed. Redistribution also facilitated ceremonial and social functions. Festivals, feasts, and religious ceremonies were supported by labor-contributed goods, demonstrating the dual economic and ideological role of MITA. Centralized storage allowed planners to synchronize production cycles with ritual calendars, ensuring that surplus resources reinforced both material stability and imperial legitimacy. Archaeological evidence of storage alignment with ceremonial plazas supports this integration of economic and ritual systems. MITA labor and redistribution networks were further enhanced by provincial coordination. Provincial governors monitored compliance, collected data on labor contributions, and oversaw the maintenance of infrastructure essential to both production and transport. This hierarchical administration ensured that labor and surplus were effectively managed across ecological zones with varying resource availability. Material evidence, including the standardization of storage architecture and road networks, illustrates the integration of local and central administration in sustaining the labor-based economy. The strategic deployment of labor also addressed environmental and logistical challenges. By organizing labor contributions across multiple ALIS and ecological zones, the Inca ensured resilience against crop failures, seasonal variations, and regional scarcity. This labor network allowed for flexible responses to environmental contingencies, with surplus redistribution smoothing out disparities in production and supporting populations during periods of risk. Pollen studies, terrace analyses, and soil stratigraphy confirm coordinated maintenance and productivity across the highlands and valleys. In practice, the MITA system and redistribution networks created a self-reinforcing economic structure. Labor obligations generated production, which was stored, redistributed, and reinvested in infrastructure, agriculture, and ceremonial projects. This continuous cycle ensured the sustainability of both imperial authority and material prosperity, linking communities directly to the operational needs of the state. Archaeological evidence demonstrates long-term continuity in labor allocation and storehouse use, reflecting institutional stability over centuries. By coordinating labor, managing surplus, and distributing resources, the Inca established an economy capable of supporting both a large population and extensive state projects. These systems allowed Cusco to maintain control over distant territories, integrate diverse communities, and provide the logistical foundation for expansion and governance. Labor sustained monumental infrastructure, providing the workforce for road construction, terrace engineering, storage management, and other large-scale projects that underpin the empire's economic and administrative systems. An empire connected without wheels or animals. Across mountains, valleys, and rivers, the Inca linked thousands of kilometers of territory through human coordination and engineering. Central to the operational capacity of the Inca Empire was the Capac-Nan, an extensive road system spanning the Andes from northern Ecuador to central Chile and Argentina. Stretching over 40,000 kilometers, this network facilitated administrative control, military mobilization, and economic integration across diverse ecological zones. Archaeological surveys reveal that roads were carefully engineered to traverse steep mountain passes, gorges, and rivers, incorporating steps, retaining walls, and drainage channels to maintain durability and year-round functionality. The Inca relied primarily on human porters for transport, as the absence of wheeled vehicles and the limited use of draft animals necessitated labor-intensive solutions. Goods, including agricultural surpluses, textiles, and ceremonial items, were carried in bundles by MITA laborers or specialized porters. Roads were designed with gradient considerations and rest points to optimize travel efficiency, reflecting detailed knowledge of terrain and human endurance. Strategic construction enabled rapid movement across regions that had previously been geographically isolated, consolidating Cusco's authority over distant provinces. Communication across the empire was facilitated by the chasca, highly trained runners stationed at regular intervals along the road network. These messengers relayed information rapidly over long distances, using relay stations and signaling techniques to transmit messages in hours that would have otherwise taken weeks. Archaeological evidence of tampu, or way stations, demonstrates the integration of infrastructure with communication, providing shelter, food, and resources for chasca personnel and travelers alike. Chroniclers describe messages carrying administrative orders, census data, and military commands, showing that information flow was essential to centralized control. Roads and way stations also supported military logistics. Garrisons could be resupplied efficiently, troops could move swiftly to respond to unrest, and equipment could be distributed across the empire. Fortifications, storage facilities, and minor roads feeding into the main Capac enabled coordinated operations over hundreds of kilometers. Excavated military installations along key routes show evidence of both strategic placement and integration with civilian infrastructure, highlighting the dual-use function of the road system. In addition to administration and military applications, the road network facilitated economic integration. Agricultural surpluses, textiles, and craft goods were transported from provincial centers to Cusco or redistributed across the empire. Storage facilities adjacent to roads and way stations allowed for temporary holding and redistribution, ensuring that local production could be leveraged to meet imperial needs. This system connected disparate ecological zones, enabling surplus from highland valleys, coastal plains, and temperate midlands to support urban centers, ceremonial events, and labor projects. The Inca also implemented a hierarchical logistical structure to manage the road system. Provincial officials oversaw maintenance of sections of the Capac Nan, coordinated labor rotations, and monitored transport and communication. Archaeological surveys reveal standardized construction techniques and maintenance strategies applied across regions, indicating central planning and oversight. These measures ensured consistency in road quality, durability, and usability, providing a reliable infrastructure that sustained both economic and administrative operations. Ritual and ceremonial functions were integrated with infrastructure. Roads often connected sacred sites, plazas, and administrative centers, reinforcing the symbolic and ideological authority of the Sapa Inca. The visibility of the road network, combined with regular movement of Chasca and MITA laborers, underscored the presence of imperial control throughout the landscape. Strategic placement of tampu and storage hubs near important religious and political locations facilitated both practical governance and ideological reinforcement. Engineering innovations were essential to overcome environmental challenges. Suspension bridges of woven fiber spanned deep gorges, stone stairways enabled steep ascent and descent, and retaining walls prevented erosion in high rainfall zones. Road surfaces were adapted to terrain, with cobblestone sections, gravel paths, and compacted earth implemented as appropriate. These innovations allowed for continuous operation despite seasonal weather variations, demonstrating the Inca's capacity to integrate labor, materials, and environmental knowledge into functional infrastructure. The road system also supported demographic management through Mitmac resettlement. Relocated populations were transported along the Capac Nan to reinforce frontier regions, provide labor, and integrate newly conquered communities. Archaeological evidence of temporary settlements and storage facilities along transport routes corroborates the logistical complexity required to sustain these population movements. This integration of infrastructure, labor, and population management highlights the interdependence of communication, administration, and imperial strategy. By coordinating roads, Chasca messengers, and logistical networks, the Inca maintained cohesion over an empire encompassing multiple ecological zones and cultural groups. The Capac then allowed Cusco to exercise authority efficiently, mobilize resources and personnel, and respond rapidly to political or environmental challenges. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the durability and adaptability of these systems, reflecting deliberate planning and centralized oversight over centuries of use. Infrastructure reinforced ideology, linking administrative, ceremonial, and economic networks while asserting the presence of the Inca state across the Andes, providing a tangible framework that supported both authority and empire-wide cohesion. Andean religion was inseparable from landscape and lineage. Mountains, rivers, and ancestral sites defined the sacred order long before the Inca emerged. The Inca inherited a complex cosmological framework from earlier Andean civilizations, including Tawantinsuyu, Wari, Moche, and Chavin. Central to this worldview was the concept of a tripartite universe, divided into Hanan Pasha, the upper world of deities and celestial forces, K Pasha, the earthly plane of daily life, and Uku Pasha, the underworld, associated with ancestors, fertility, and subterranean forces. Archaeological excavations of ceremonial centers, such as Tawantinsu's Kalasasaya and Wari Huacas, reveal architectural alignments and iconography reflecting these divisions, demonstrating the long-standing integration of cosmology into social and political life. Sacred geography played a crucial role in the organization of ritual and political authority. Certain mountains, rivers, springs, and stone outcrops, collectively referred to as huacas, were venerated as intermediaries between the spiritual and material worlds. Offerings, including ceramics, textiles, and human and camelid sacrifices, were deposited at these sites, reflecting ritualized engagement with natural features. Evidence from Tawantinsuyu and Wari ceremonial platforms shows deliberate placement of structures and pathways that aligned with astronomical events and local topography, illustrating the inseparability of landscape and religious practice. Ancestor veneration was central to Andean religiosity. Lineage heads and elite families maintained shrines, mummified remains, and relics of prominent forebears, emphasizing continuity of authority across generations. Archaeological analysis of Wari tombs and ceremonial complexes indicates that these practices were intertwined with governance, as ancestral cults legitimized political power and structured social hierarchy. This framework provided the Inca with a model for linking ruling authority to divine sanction and hereditary legitimacy. Animism and duality further structured pre-Inca belief systems. Natural phenomena, rivers, mountains, rocks were perceived as sentient or spiritually potent, while dualities such as male/female, upper/lower, and dry/wet were encoded into ceremonial symbolism. Architectural evidence from Tawantinsuyu and Wari sites demonstrates the integration of these dualities into urban planning, plaza orientation, and ritual paraphernalia, highlighting the sophisticated conceptual organization underpinning Andean religious practice. Rather than creating an entirely new religion, the Inca reorganized and centralized existing cosmologies to support imperial integration. Sacred sites were incorporated into a network linking Cusco with distant provinces, while the veneration of ancestors and huacas became regulated under state authority. The continuity of ritual practice ensured legitimacy, while centralization allowed for the mobilization of ceremonial labor, tribute, and ideological reinforcement across the empire. Archaeological studies of Cusco and provincial shrines reveal standardized construction patterns, suggesting deliberate coordination between local and imperial ritual priorities. Ceremonial artifacts and iconography demonstrate the transmission of religious knowledge across generations. Stone carvings, textiles, and ceramics exhibit motifs related to agricultural fertility, celestial phenomena, and ancestral power, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. These material expressions allowed the Inca to integrate multiple ethnic groups under a shared sacred framework, fostering cohesion while maintaining respect for regional identities. The cosmological worldview also structured temporal and political organization. Ritual calendars aligned agricultural cycles with ceremonial observances, linking labor, production, and religious practice. State authorities coordinated festivals to reinforce loyalty, redistribute surplus, and mobilize labor, demonstrating the practical function of religion in governance. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial plazas and terraced agricultural sites shows alignment with solstices and equinoxes, confirming the interdependence of ritual timing and resource management. By grounding political authority in the sacred, the Inca framed expansion, taxation, and administration as expressions of divine order. The integration of cosmology into governance provided a rationale for centralized power, legitimized elite lineages, and structured social obligations. Sacred geography and ritual networks became tools of imperial control, embedding authority within both landscape and lineage. These beliefs were later centralized into a state-controlled religious system, allowing the Inca to transform inherited cosmologies into mechanisms of imperial cohesion, ritual standardization, and political legitimacy across their expanding territories. Religion became a tool of imperial cohesion. By elevating Inti, the sun deity, the Inca linked divine authority directly to the state. During the 15th century CE, the Inca centralized religious practice around the cult of Inti, positioning the sun god as the supreme deity of the empire. This shift did not abolish regional religious traditions. Rather, it incorporated and harmonized them within a state-sponsored framework. Archaeological evidence indicates that major temples, most notably the Coricancha in Cusco, served as focal points for solar worship, ceremonial gatherings, and administrative coordination, reinforcing Cusco as both a political and spiritual capital. The Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, was carefully aligned with solar events such as solstices and equinoxes, highlighting the integration of cosmology into imperial planning. Excavations reveal finely cut stone architecture, gold plating, and subsidiary structures, demonstrating both material investment and ideological emphasis. Within the temple complex, offerings of food, textiles, and crafted objects facilitated ritual reciprocity between humans and the divine, while ceremonies were coordinated to reinforce seasonal cycles and agricultural productivity. Spanish chroniclers, including Garcilaso de la Vega and Pedro Cieza de Leon, describe Inti as the supreme deity, to whom all regional gods were subordinated. Archaeological evidence, however, suggests syncretism rather than outright replacement. Local deities and sacred sites continued to be venerated, with rituals often performed alongside or integrated into state-sanctioned ceremonies. This dual approach enabled the Inca to assert central authority while respecting regional traditions, facilitating compliance and loyalty across a diverse empire. The cult of Inti was intimately linked to political authority. The Sapa Inca was considered the son of the sun, embodying both spiritual and temporal power. Rituals at Coricancha and provincial temples often emphasized this divine lineage, legitimizing elite rule and connecting imperial obligations, such as labor and tribute, to cosmic order. Architectural alignments and ceremonial platforms reinforced the perception that imperial governance was sanctioned by the highest deity, providing a tangible manifestation of sacred authority. Religious centralization supported administrative cohesion. Festivals and solar ceremonies required coordinated labor, redistribution of resources, and organized participation from provincial communities. Archaeological surveys indicate standardized plazas and ceremonial structures in multiple regions, suggesting systematic replication of religious practice and alignment with Cusco's ritual calendar. This integration of ritual and administration ensured that religion functioned both as ideology and practical governance. State-controlled religious activities also facilitated social and economic management. Offerings and feasts distributed surplus, reinforcing loyalty and demonstrating the capacity of Cusco to organize resources. The MITA labor system was often mobilized in service of temple construction, maintenance, and festival preparation, linking spiritual devotion to tangible contributions that strengthened the empire's material and ideological foundation. Provincial communities were encouraged to maintain local religious practices, but these were increasingly framed within the imperial context. Huacas and ancestral shrines were incorporated into broader ceremonial networks, ensuring alignment with state objectives while preserving localized devotion. This strategy minimized resistance and reinforced Cusco's central authority without requiring cultural erasure, reflecting a pragmatic approach to religious governance. Symbolism played a key role in reinforcing Inti's supremacy. Gold, associated with sunlight, adorned temples, ritual objects, and offerings, visually connecting wealth, celestial power, and political control. Architectural orientation, plazas, and roads linking religious centers across the empire further emphasized the integration of spiritual and administrative networks, ensuring that sacred and temporal authority were mutually reinforcing. By institutionalizing the cult of Inti, the Inca created a state religion that served multiple functions, legitimizing Sapa Inca authority, integrating provincial communities, coordinating labor and resource mobilization, and linking ecological management to ritual observance. This system allowed religion to operate simultaneously as ideology, administration, and instrument of social cohesion. Sacred authority extended directly into rulership itself, as the Sapa Inca embodied both divine and political power, merging cosmological legitimacy with centralized governance to reinforce imperial hierarchy across the Andes. In death, Inca rulers continued to govern. Royal authority did not end with life but persisted through mummified remains and ritual practice. The Sapa Inca was considered both a political and divine figure, embodying celestial authority as the son of the sun. This status extended beyond death through the veneration of royal mummies, or malka, which retained both spiritual and administrative significance. Mummified rulers were preserved in prominent locations within Cusco and regional centers, where they continued to exercise influence over land, resources, and ritual observances. Spanish chroniclers, including Cieza de Leon and Garcilaso de la Vega, describe elaborate ceremonies honoring these ancestors, emphasizing their ongoing political presence and the obligations of living subjects to maintain their estates and ritual duties. Archaeological evidence supports the continued use of mummies in governance. Excavations at Cusco indicate dedicated storage areas and ceremonial platforms for Malka, alongside artifacts such as ceremonial vessels, textiles, and offerings. These spaces were not merely symbolic. They facilitated the redistribution of wealth and coordinated labor, with attendants maintaining the mummy's household, managing landholdings, and supervising provincial obligations. In effect, the deceased ruler remained an active participant in imperial administration. The political implications of divine kingship were substantial. Succession was regulated by ritual and lineage, with new Sapa Inca assuming authority alongside the cult of the deceased. Mummies served as mediators between past and present rulers, legitimizing claims to power and reinforcing continuity of governance. Spanish accounts note that councils consulted Malka during disputes, illustrating how ancestor veneration intersected with practical decision-making and conflict resolution. Royal mummies also shaped land and labor management. Estates assigned to deceased rulers continued to produce crops, textiles, and resources, which were then redistributed for ceremonial or state purposes. MITA labor and provincial tribute were often mobilized to sustain these estates, integrating mortuary practices into broader economic and administrative systems. Archaeological surveys of storage facilities and associated terraces corroborate the scale of production linked to Malka, demonstrating the intertwining of ritual and material management. Ritual power extended to social hierarchy and provincial organization. Living elites participated in ceremonies honoring Malka, reinforcing loyalty and obligation. These practices connected provincial communities to Cusco and to the broader framework of divine kingship. Ancestor cults provided both ideological cohesion and a mechanism for reinforcing imperial authority without relying solely on coercion. The continued presence of royal mummies symbolized the enduring reach of Cusco into distant regions. The integration of mortuary practices and governance also contributed to factional dynamics within the imperial elite. Competing claims to succession, rivalries over estates, and the need to honor multiple Malka simultaneously created political pressures that occasionally led to conflict. Spanish chroniclers document disputes during periods of contested succession, illustrating the tension between the centralizing authority of the living ruler and the persistent influence of deceased predecessors. The Inca system of divine kingship exemplified a non-Western model of political authority, where mortality did not terminate governance. Rulers, both living and dead, were embedded within networks of ritual, labor, and resource management that maintained continuity across generations. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms the deliberate integration of mummified ancestors into the administrative, ceremonial, and economic structures of the empire. By linking rulership to ancestral veneration, the Inca established structural continuity, ensuring that each generation of leaders inherited both material and ideological authority. This system reinforced social cohesion, centralized control, and loyalty to Cusco while embedding governance within the spiritual and cultural framework of the Andes. These religious systems shaped daily social organization, influencing labor obligations, ceremonial participation, and the relationship between communities and state authority, embedding sacred authority into the rhythms of Andean life. Inca society was organized through kinship, not citizenship. Families and lineages formed the framework of both daily life and imperial administration. The Ayllu was the foundational social unit of the Inca Empire, integrating kinship, labor, and land tenure into a cohesive system that structured both economic and political life. Each Ayllu consisted of extended families tracing descent from a common ancestor, and membership determined access to land, obligations to perform labor, and participation in ritual life. Archaeological evidence from highland villages shows consistent patterns of terrace allocation, shared storage facilities, and settlement organization, reflecting the central role of kinship in resource management. Social stratification within the empire was formalized through noble, commoner, and servant classes. Nobility, often drawn from royal or elite lineages, held administrative positions, governed provincial territories, and performed ceremonial duties. Commoners, the majority of the population, contributed labor through agricultural production, MITA obligations, and artisan work. Archaeological analyses of housing, stone foundations for elite residences versus simpler adobe structures for commoners, and burial differentiation, including grave goods and tomb size, support this hierarchical organization. Yanacona, permanent retainers attached to noble households or state service, provided specialized labor while remaining outside standard Elu obligations. The Elu also structured marriage and inheritance. Land was held collectively, allocated among members based on need and family size, and redistributed periodically to maintain equitable access. Marriage arrangements were often endogamous within the Elu or closely allied Alis, reinforcing social cohesion and strengthening economic and political alliances. Administrative records, supported by Spanish chroniclers, describe structured obligations for each household, ensuring that labor, agricultural production, and ceremonial participation were organized efficiently. Labor organization under the Elu was tightly linked to state and local needs. Households contributed to terrace maintenance, irrigation projects, and food production, balancing local consumption with tribute obligations. Specialized labor, such as weaving, pottery, and metalworking, was also coordinated through the Elu, with surpluses allocated to provincial or imperial storehouses. Settlement patterns reveal clustering of workshops, granaries, and ceremonial plazas within the Elu, demonstrating the integration of daily life, labor, and ritual practice. Religious obligations were similarly embedded in social structure. Alis maintained ancestral shrines and local huacas, coordinating offerings and rituals that reinforced both kinship ties and imperial loyalty. Participation in festivals and ceremonial activities linked households to broader imperial ideology, ensuring cohesion through ritual practice as well as economic and political interdependence. Archaeological evidence of shared ritual spaces within settlements supports the centrality of these obligations to daily life. The hierarchical relationship between the Elu and the state was mediated through provincial administrators, who coordinated tribute, MITA labor, and ceremonial participation. Nobles acted as intermediaries, translating state directives into local organization, while commoners executed labor and produced goods. This system allowed the Inca to mobilize human and material resources efficiently while maintaining local social cohesion. Records and settlement evidence indicate that compliance was reinforced by both ritual authority and practical governance, linking kinship networks directly to imperial administration. Gender roles were integrated into Elu organization. Men primarily engaged in agricultural labor, construction, and military obligations, while women contributed to textile production, food preparation, and domestic management. Some women served in elite or religious capacities, including positions within the Aklawasi, where selected women performed ceremonial duties and produced textiles for the state. Household and community divisions of labor were structured to meet both subsistence and state requirements, illustrating the interdependence of family, Elu, and empire. Through the Elu, social hierarchy structured daily life, labor, and ideology. It balanced local autonomy with obligations to the state, facilitated resource distribution, and maintained ritual continuity. Settlement patterns, storage systems, and ceremonial architecture demonstrate how kinship organized economic production, political participation, and spiritual life in an integrated manner. Social organization defined everyday life, shaping labor, family responsibilities, and ritual practice, and providing the framework through which the empire mobilized resources, maintained order, and reinforced loyalty to Cusco. Gender roles were structured, not marginal. Men and women contributed distinct yet complementary functions that sustained both family and state. In the Inca Empire, social organization extended deeply into gendered labor divisions within households, alis, and state institutions. Men typically handled agriculture, construction, and military duties, while women focused on food preparation, domestic management, and textile production. Archaeological evidence from highland terraces, domestic sites, and specialized workshops demonstrates that these roles were integral to the functioning of households and local communities, rather than indicative of marginalization. Spanish chroniclers note that men and women were considered complementary in their responsibilities, and both contributed to the economic and ritual obligations of the Elu. Textile production exemplified women's central economic and ritual role. Cotton and camelid fibers were spun, dyed, and woven into garments, ceremonial tunics, and offerings. Excavated workshops, spindle whorls, and weaving implements demonstrate the scale and specialization of textile labor. Surpluses were directed to provincial and imperial storehouses, supporting redistribution and ceremonial needs. Women in elite households often oversaw or directly participated in this production, connecting domestic labor to broader state objectives. Some women were selected for service in the aklawasi, institutions that trained chosen females for ceremonial, religious, and administrative duties. These women, often referred to as virgins of the sun, prepared ritual foods, wove ceremonial textiles, and participated in offerings and feasts. Aklawasi were situated in provincial centers and Cusco itself, providing a link between local communities and state ideology. Archaeological and ethno-historic records indicate that these institutions also served as centers of education, ritual instruction, and resource production. Elite education for men took place in Yachawasi, or houses of knowledge, where sons of noble families received training in administration, record-keeping, military organization, and religious ritual. These institutions facilitated social reproduction of the administrative class, ensuring that knowledge of governance, labor mobilization, and ceremonial practice was transmitted systematically. Spanish chroniclers describe Yachawasi curricula that included memorization of quipu use, oral history, and practical management skills. Marriage and family organization reinforced both economic and social stability. Households were structured to allocate labor effectively, coordinate agricultural production, and maintain ritual obligations. Women played a central role in intergenerational transmission of domestic and ritual knowledge, ensuring continuity of social norms and technical skills. Male and female roles intersected with Elu obligations, aligning household labor with broader economic, ceremonial, and administrative systems. Evidence suggests that gendered labor was complementary rather than hierarchical. Men's and women's contributions were both necessary to sustain the household, produce tribute, and fulfill state projects. Domestic artifacts, specialized tools, and spatial organization of settlements indicate that responsibilities were carefully distributed to maximize productivity and social cohesion. Spanish accounts reinforce this perspective, noting respect for women's labor and their essential participation in local economies and ritual life. Education and ritual training for both genders strengthened the integration of households into state structures. Knowledge transmission, whether through Yachawasi, Aklawasi, or domestic mentorship, ensured that labor, craft production, and ceremonial obligations were performed consistently across generations. This systematic approach allowed the empire to mobilize human resources efficiently while reinforcing social norms, religious practice, and political hierarchy. Through structured gender roles, family organization, and education, the Inca ensured that daily labor and ritual obligations were coordinated at both household and imperial scales. The integration of domestic labor, craft production, and formal instruction provided a foundation for economic stability, social cohesion, and ideological continuity. Material evidence from workshops, terraces, storage facilities, and ritual sites confirms the practical implementation of these systems throughout the empire. Daily life was sustained by material systems, including agricultural infrastructure, labor organization, and craft production, which provided the resources necessary to maintain social order, ritual practice, and imperial governance. Health reflected geography more than wealth. Across the Andes, altitude, environment, and resources shaped the daily lives and well-being of the Inca. Bioarchaeological evidence provides detailed insight into the health, diet, and living conditions of the Inca and their subjects. Analysis of skeletal remains from highland valleys, coastal regions, and urban centers indicates a diet based on both ecological availability and state provisioning. Staple crops included potatoes, maize, quinoa, and legumes, supplemented by camelid meat and fish in coastal and highland communities. Stable isotope studies confirm regional variation, showing reliance on tubers at high altitudes and maize or aquatic protein in lower valleys. Dental wear patterns suggest regular consumption of gritty maize flour, while evidence of malnutrition or anemia corresponds with environmental stressors rather than social class alone. Cranial modification was a widespread cultural practice, particularly among elites, reflecting both social identity and aesthetic norms. Elongation and flattening of skulls were achieved in infancy, signifying lineage or status, but had no apparent impact on health outcomes. Burial practices indicate social stratification, with elite graves showing greater access to preserved foods, ceremonial items, and imported materials, while commoner interments contain fewer goods. These patterns reinforce the connection between material culture, social hierarchy, and daily life. Disease patterns varied regionally and were influenced by altitude, climate, and exposure to pathogens. Evidence of respiratory infections, osteoarthritis, and dental pathologies is prevalent in highland populations, reflecting physical labor demands and environmental conditions. Epidemics introduced after European contact disproportionately affected densely populated urban centers, but prior to contact, morbidity was primarily localized and chronic. Archaeological analysis of skeletal trauma indicates frequent engagement in labor-intensive agriculture, construction, and military activities, with injuries treated through traditional methods and community support. The distribution of storehouses, kulkas, contributed to food security and mitigated environmental risk. Granaries were strategically located to serve agricultural zones, administrative centers, and ceremonial sites, ensuring a reliable supply of staple crops. Bioarchaeological evidence, including preserved seeds, storage residues, and associated labor infrastructure, demonstrates that surplus production and strategic distribution reduced the likelihood of famine and allowed population growth in ecologically challenging regions. Regional variation in storehouse density corresponds closely with population size, agricultural potential, and imperial priorities. Housing and settlement patterns also influenced living conditions. Elite residences in Cusco and major provincial centers were often stone-built, multi-roomed, and located near plazas or administrative facilities, providing relative protection from environmental hazards. Commoner dwellings, typically constructed from adobe or wattle and daub, were smaller, clustered around terraced fields, and often shared communal spaces. Analysis of settlement organization indicates that social cohesion, labor coordination, and access to water and storage were central to daily life, reinforcing the role of social structure in maintaining well-being. Life expectancy was highly variable, reflecting environmental, social, and occupational factors. Archaeological and osteological evidence suggests that elite individuals often lived longer than commoners due to lower exposure to physical labor, better nutrition, and access to ceremonial resources. However, altitude, climate, and regional disease burden could offset these advantages, making health outcomes more dependent on geography than wealth alone. Mortality patterns show high infant and child mortality, consistent with pre-industrial societies, but robust adult survival allowed for sustained participation in labor, governance, and ritual life. Medical knowledge and communal health practices were also integrated into daily life. Treatments included herbal remedies, surgical interventions such as trepanation, and ritualized healing practices. Evidence from skeletal analysis confirms the use of antiseptic techniques and the healing of cranial interventions, indicating empirical understanding of human anatomy and trauma management. These practices were often coordinated through ALU and provincial networks, linking healthcare to both family and state structures. The Inca emphasis on dietary diversity, storage management, and settlement planning reflects a sophisticated approach to public health. Food security, labor organization, and material infrastructure intersected to mitigate environmental and occupational risks, sustaining the population across diverse ecological zones. Bioarchaeological, the Inca army was seasonal, not permanent. Rather than maintaining standing forces, The empire mobilized populations as needed for defense, conquest, and infrastructure. Military service in the Inca Empire was organized primarily through the MITA system, which required communities to provide men for periodic military campaigns. Service obligations were rotated to balance local agricultural needs with imperial demands, ensuring that labor contributions for war did not undermine subsistence production. Spanish chroniclers, including Pedro Cieza de Leon, described the mobilization of thousands of troops from each province, coordinated by local administrators under the supervision of Cusco's central authority. Archaeological evidence of weapon caches, ceremonial deposits, and fortifications corroborates these accounts, demonstrating the scale and organization of the Inca military apparatus. The hierarchical structure of the army was clearly delineated. Leadership positions were filled by members of the nobility, including provincial governors and royal relatives, who acted as generals and strategic planners. Rank-and-file soldiers were drawn from commoner populations, organized into units according to ALU affiliation and regional origin. These units were trained in basic combat techniques, including slings, clubs, spears, and bows, while elite units received specialized training in leadership, tactics, and terrain exploitation. Weaponry recovered from archaeological sites, including bronze-tipped spears, stone slings, and projectile points, confirms the diversity and standardization of armaments. Training emphasized coordination, mobility, and discipline rather than permanent deployment. Soldiers were drilled in formations suitable for mountainous terrain, river crossings, and siege scenarios. Road networks, such as the Kapak Nan, facilitated rapid movement and logistical support, allowing seasonal armies to mobilize effectively across great distances. This system ensured that the Inca could concentrate forces strategically while minimizing the economic burden of maintaining a standing army. The recruitment process incorporated social and administrative mechanisms. ALIS were responsible for nominating eligible men based on age, fitness, and household obligations. Nobles oversaw training and integration into larger provincial contingents, while provincial governors coordinated deployment schedules. Spanish records note that the rotation of military service allowed communities to continue agricultural production, reflecting a deliberate balance between economic stability and imperial security. Archaeological fortifications across the empire indicate the dual function of military infrastructure, defensive and administrative. Sites such as Ollantaytambo, Sacsayhuaman, and Pisac demonstrate the integration of walls, terraces, and observation posts that allowed rapid deployment and territorial control. These constructions required organized labor, standardized planning, and logistical support, reinforcing the connection between military organization and state capacity. In addition to combat, military forces performed engineering and logistical functions. Troops built roads, bridges, and storehouses to support campaigns and maintain supply lines. This integration of labor and martial activity ensured that military mobilization reinforced imperial cohesion, while simultaneously contributing to infrastructure that supported trade, communication, and governance. Archaeological surveys confirm the presence of roads and fortified way stations constructed and maintained by seasonal conscripts. The Inca also employed specialized units for reconnaissance, messenger duties, and regional policing. Chasca messengers, often drawn from military contingents, relayed intelligence and coordinated movements across the road network. Provincial militias supplemented central forces, providing localized security and enforcing tribute collection. This layered structure allowed the empire to respond flexibly to internal unrest and external threats without maintaining large permanent armies. By linking recruitment, training, and deployment to the MITA system, the Inca integrated military service into broader social and economic structures. Service obligations reinforced loyalty to the state, facilitated knowledge of imperial administration, and connected local communities to Cusco's strategic priorities. Weapons, fortifications, and logistical networks demonstrate that military organization was not isolated but embedded within the material and administrative systems of the empire. Military force supported expansion, providing the means to project imperial authority, secure newly conquered territories, and reinforce the administrative, economic, and ideological frameworks that underpinned the Inca Empire. and isotopic evidence collectively demonstrates that well-being was a product of geography, labor systems, and state administration rather than purely individual wealth or status. Society depended on territorial control as access to land, water, and ecological resources underpinned health, diet, and daily living, linking population well-being directly to the broader administrative and imperial framework. Empire spread through strategy, not annihilation. The Inca relied as much on negotiation, alliances, and population management as on military force. Inca expansion combined military action with diplomatic integration, creating a system of indirect rule that minimized resistance while consolidating authority. Newly incorporated regions were often governed through local elites who retained nominal power under Cusco's supervision. Hostage policies were central to this approach. Sons of provincial leaders were relocated to Cusco, where they were educated in Inca administrative practices and served as guarantees of compliance. Spanish chroniclers, including Cieza de Leon, detail the use of hostages as both a tool of loyalty and a means of cultural assimilation. The empire also employed Micmac resettlement, moving entire communities to strategic locations to consolidate control, reinforce frontier regions, or relieve demographic pressure. Archaeological and ethno-historical evidence indicates that relocated populations were provided with land, agricultural tools, and integration into local elites, ensuring both survival and loyalty. Micmac policies served multiple functions. They dispersed potential descent, populated sparsely settled areas, and facilitated cultural integration while maintaining labor contributions to the state. In addition to population management, Inca diplomacy emphasized alliance building, tribute agreements, and recognition of local religious and political structures. Conquered leaders were often allowed to continue ceremonial duties and maintain local shrines, provided that they acknowledged the Sapa Inca's supremacy and participated in imperial rituals. This pragmatic approach reduced the need for continual military enforcement, fostering stability through cooperation and mutual obligation. Spanish chroniclers document campaigns in regions such as northern Ecuador, southern Chile, and the Bolivian highlands, highlighting the combination of negotiation and force. Cities and provinces that resisted were subdued militarily, but subsequent governance relied on integrating existing political hierarchies into the imperial framework. Micmac relocation and strategic marriages further reinforced the authority of Cusco over distant regions, embedding imperial presence into social and familial networks. The Inca also coordinated infrastructure and logistics to support conquest and integration. Roads, storage facilities, and fortifications allowed rapid deployment of troops and provisions, ensuring that new territories were connected to Cusco and other provincial centers. Archaeological surveys reveal that resettled communities were often located near major routes or fortified sites, facilitating both surveillance and participation in the imperial economy. Conquest and resettlement policies were closely linked to labor and economic obligations. Relocated populations contributed to agricultural production, craftwork, and MITA service, sustaining imperial projects and ceremonial events. This integration of labor, territory, and population management allowed the empire to expand rapidly while maintaining functional governance across diverse ecological zones. By combining strategic military campaigns, negotiation, and population relocation, the Inca created a flexible system of control that emphasized integration rather than annihilation. Provinces were incorporated into a network of administrative, ritual, and economic relationships, ensuring that expansion strengthened rather than destabilized the empire. This approach allowed Cusco to maintain authority over a vast and ecologically diverse territory with a relatively small professional administrative corps. Military success brought administrative strain, as newly conquered regions required governance, labor coordination, and integration into the imperial system, necessitating innovations in bureaucracy, communication, and provincial oversight. Control required constant presence. Even a well-organized empire depended on mechanisms to enforce authority and deter rebellion. Despite strategic diplomacy and resettlement, the Inca Empire faced periodic resistance in provincial territories. Communities sometimes refused tribute, resisted conscription, or challenged local governors. Spanish chroniclers describe uprisings in regions such as the Chachapoya Highlands, and the southern valleys of present-day Chile, illustrating the ongoing tension between local autonomy and imperial authority. Archaeological evidence indicates that fortifications, garrisons, and administrative centers were established to project Cusco's power and respond swiftly to unrest. The construction of fortresses, such as Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, exemplifies the dual role of architecture in defense and political signaling. Massive stone walls, strategic vantage points, and integrated storage facilities allowed rapid deployment of troops, served as deterrents, and centralized control over the surrounding valley. Similar fortified sites were replicated across the empire's frontiers, enabling regional governors to maintain surveillance and respond to insubordination efficiently. Provincial control relied on both military and administrative systems. Local governors coordinated tribute collection, labor obligations, and ceremonial compliance, often supported by garrison forces. The presence of military personnel in provincial centers reinforced loyalty while maintaining order. Records and archaeological surveys suggest that fortresses and plazas were frequently used for training, storage, and administrative functions, illustrating the integration of governance with security infrastructure. The Mitmac system and strategic resettlement continued to serve as preventative measures against rebellion. Relocated populations created buffer zones, diluted concentrations of potentially hostile groups, and facilitated closer monitoring by provincial authorities. Additionally, hostages from elite families were often stationed at administrative centers, creating incentives for compliance and providing mechanisms for rapid enforcement if dissent emerged. Communication networks were critical to provincial control. The Kapaknan road system allowed Chasca messengers to transmit intelligence on disturbances, troop movements, and resource needs between Cusco and distant provinces. This enabled centralized coordination of military responses while maintaining the appearance of omnipresent authority. Archaeological evidence of way stations, storage facilities, and signaling platforms supports the role of logistics in sustaining imperial oversight. Rebellions were often met with combined diplomatic and military measures. Confrontations could result in temporary displacement, redistribution of populations, or punitive labor obligations, while negotiation and accommodation were used to reintegrate communities into the imperial framework. This flexible approach allowed the Inca to manage resistance without committing excessive resources to permanent suppression. The Inca emphasis on surveillance, deterrence, and rapid response ensured that provincial control remained effective across ecologically and culturally diverse regions. Fortresses, garrisons, resettlement policies, and communication networks functioned in concert, creating a multi-layered system of authority. Spanish sources confirm that local governors relied on both military preparedness and social mechanisms to enforce compliance, maintaining stability in the absence of standing armies at every site. By combining military presence, administrative oversight, and strategic integration of populations, the Inca maintained control over a vast empire despite sporadic resistance. Provincial authorities were empowered to act decisively, yet their power was embedded within a broader system of accountability to Cusco, ensuring that rebellion was both deterred and manageable. Imperial scale created systemic pressures, as the logistical, administrative, and social demands of governing distant provinces required increasingly sophisticated coordination of resources, labor, and authority across the Andes. The empire reached its limits at its height. From the highlands of Ecuador to the valleys of central Chile, the Inca governed one of the largest and most diverse empires in pre-Columbian America. By the early 16th century, Tawantinsuyu extended over approximately 4,000 kilometers along the Andean spine, encompassing present-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, northern Chile, and northwestern Argentina. This vast territorial reach incorporated a wide range of ecological zones, from tropical lowlands to high-altitude puna, requiring the coordination of diverse agricultural systems, labor contributions, and regional governance structures. Spanish chroniclers report the formidable size of the empire, emphasizing the challenges of administration, tribute collection, and communication across such varied landscapes. The empire was divided into 4 suyus: Chinchaysuyu, Antisuyu, Culasuyu, and Conquistadors, each radiating from the capital, Cusco, and connected by the extensive Capac-Nan road system. Roads facilitated movement of armies, chasca messengers, and goods. Yet even these logistical innovations were strained by distance, elevation, and terrain. Bridges, stairways, and way stations allowed communication and supply lines to function across mountains, rivers, and deserts, but provincial governors frequently faced difficulties in synchronizing local production, labor obligations, and ceremonial schedules with central directives. Administration relied on provincial governors and local elites, whose authority was reinforced by oversight from Cusco, as well as by ritual, tribute, and the presence of hostages. Micmac resettlement continued to redistribute populations to strategic locations, maintaining social cohesion and imperial oversight. However, as the empire expanded, these systems became increasingly complex, requiring precise coordination to ensure loyalty and resource flow. Archaeological surveys indicate that the density of administrative centers and storage facilities increased proportionally to distance from Cusco, reflecting efforts to maintain control over far-flung territories. The diversity of languages, customs, and ecological practices further complicated governance. While Quechua functioned as the lingua franca for administration, many regions maintained distinct local languages and traditions. Integrating these populations into a cohesive imperial system required adaptation of tribute, labor, and ritual obligations to local conditions, illustrating the flexibility and limits of Inca administration. Military oversight remained a critical component of territorial maintenance. Fortresses and garrisons were strategically located near frontiers and in restive provinces, ensuring rapid response to resistance or rebellion. Chasca messengers carried reports of uprisings or logistical needs, but delays caused by terrain or weather could hinder timely intervention. Despite these systems, the sheer size of the empire stretched the capacity of Cusco to monitor all provinces simultaneously, leaving some regions more autonomous in practice than in theory. Economic integration across Tawantinsuyu was facilitated by regional specialization, with different ecological zones producing complementary resources. Highland communities supplied potatoes, quinoa, and camelid fiber, while coastal and lowland regions contributed maize, fish, and tropical crops. These goods were collected, stored, and redistributed through administrative centers, sustaining urban populations and ceremonial obligations. Yet coordinating this complex flow over great distances imposed significant administrative and logistical strain. Ritual and ceremonial obligations also intensified with expansion. Festivals, offerings, and pilgrimages required precise timing and coordination across suyus, aligning agricultural cycles, labor mobilization, and political events. The replication of Coricancha-style temples and huacas in provincial centers reinforced ideological cohesion, but maintaining consistent participation in distant regions taxed both communication and local compliance. By the 1520s, the empire had reached its maximum territorial extent, and its systems of labor, tribute, communication, and governance were operating at the limits of capacity. The scale of Tawantinsuyu demanded highly trained administrators, disciplined labor forces, and loyal local elites. Yet even minor disruptions could cascade through the system. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that some provinces experienced delays in tribute collection, localized resistance, and logistical bottlenecks, highlighting the inherent challenges of maintaining cohesion over such a vast and ecologically diverse territory. The empire's centralized control was thus both a source of strength and a potential vulnerability. Cusco's ability to project authority across thousands of kilometers depended on integrated infrastructure, social compliance, and administrative efficiency, yet distance, local variation, and human error increasingly tested the limits of imperial capacity. By consolidating control over distant regions, the Inca created unprecedented political and economic integration, but also exposed systemic pressures that would influence succession, provincial loyalty, and imperial stability. Expansion intensified internal tensions, as administrative strain, logistical complexity, and the challenges of integrating diverse populations set the stage for factional conflict, succession disputes, and eventual vulnerability to external pressures. Growth magnified instability. As Tawantinsuyu expanded, the mechanisms that supported its integration also heightened the risks of internal conflict. The Inca succession system, while guided by lineage and ritual, lacked codified rules that could prevent disputes among potential heirs. Typically, the Sapa Inca designated a successor from among his sons, prioritizing the eldest legitimate son of the principal queen. However, multiple concubines and secondary wives produced competing lineages, creating ambiguity over legitimate claims. Spanish chroniclers, including Pedro Cieza de Leon and Garcilaso de la Vega, report that disputes between royal siblings were common, and succession often required negotiation among nobles, provincial governors, and military leaders. These tensions were amplified by the empire's size, which allowed regional factions to form around rival claimants. Factionalism emerged not only from dynastic ambiguity but also from provincial loyalty and local power structures. As the empire expanded, governors and military commanders accumulated influence in their respective regions, often controlling local labor, resources, and military contingents. During succession disputes, these elites could align with competing heirs, effectively creating parallel centers of power. Archaeological and ethno-historical evidence indicates that fortified sites, administrative centers, and ceremonial plazas sometimes functioned as focal points for factional support, illustrating the intertwining of geography, governance, and succession politics. Administrative overload compounded instability. The sheer scale of Tawantinsuyu required continuous coordination of tribute, labor, ceremonial obligations, and infrastructure maintenance. Provincial governors and central administrators managed complex logistics, but delays or mismanagement could create localized discontent, particularly when coupled with ambiguous authority. Chroniclers describe instances in which delayed tribute collection or miscommunication led to unrest, which could be exploited by ambitious claimants to consolidate support. This interplay between bureaucratic strain and succession vulnerability heightened the risk of civil discord. Mitigation strategies were employed but had limits. Hostage systems and Micmac resettlement continued to enforce loyalty, yet as regional populations grew and administrative demands multiplied, these mechanisms were increasingly strained. Hostages could secure allegiance in theory, but distant provinces could resist or realign in response to weakened central authority. Similarly, resettled communities facilitated control and cultural integration, but their displacement sometimes generated resentment, creating additional opportunities for factional mobilization. The integration of military, administrative, and ritual structures also influenced succession dynamics. Armies remained loyal to the Sapa Inca but could be leveraged by ambitious factions, while ceremonial obligations reinforced legitimacy claims. Control over sacred sites, temples, and Malka estates was often contested during transitions of power. Spanish sources describe rival heirs conducting parallel ceremonies, asserting spiritual authority as a basis for political claim, demonstrating how ritual and governance intersected in succession disputes. Historical accounts suggest that tensions escalated into armed confrontation when rival factions could no longer negotiate settlements. These conflicts, though limited in duration, revealed structural vulnerabilities in Tawantinsuyu's governance. Fortresses and provincial strongholds became strategic bases for claimants, while Chaska networks facilitated coordination and intelligence gathering. Archaeological evidence of rapid fortification, increased garrison presence, and localized destruction supports chronicler descriptions of these internal conflicts. The combination of expansion, administrative strain, and dynastic ambiguity illustrates a systemic tension inherent in imperial growth. As Tawantinsuyu integrated diverse populations, complex logistics, and overlapping social hierarchies, the mechanisms that enabled stability under a strong ruler could be destabilizing during periods of transition. Succession disputes illuminated the limits of centralized control and the dependence of imperial cohesion on effective leadership, communication, and regional compliance. Despite these stresses, the Inca system retained resilience through institutionalized practices. Provincial governors, military leaders, and religious authorities often mediated disputes, ensuring that temporary conflicts did not dissolve the empire entirely. Nevertheless, the simultaneous pressures of succession uncertainty, administrative overload, and geographic dispersion created conditions in which civil war became increasingly probable. By the early 1530s, these combined factors, dynastic competition, factional alliances, and bureaucratic strain, rendered Tawantinsuyu vulnerable. Internal divisions weakened the empire's capacity to respond to external threats, while logistical and administrative pressures limited Cusco's ability to enforce rapid solutions. This period illustrates how systemic growth can both empower and destabilize a centralized state, highlighting the delicate balance between expansion and internal cohesion. These pressures erupted into civil war, as competing heirs and provincial factions mobilized resources, military forces, and ritual authority to contest the succession, setting the stage for conflict that would profoundly affect the empire's ability to respond to external challenges. Civil war fractured imperial authority. Tawantinsuyu, once tightly organized, became internally divided as rival claimants contested the throne. The death of Huayna Capac around 1527 triggered a succession crisis that pitted his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, against one another. Huáscar, based in Cusco, claimed legitimacy as the heir of the principal queen, while Atahualpa, governing the northern provinces, leveraged local support and military forces to assert his claim. The empire's recent expansion and the decentralization of provincial administration intensified the dispute, as governors, military leaders, and local elites aligned with one or the other sibling according to regional loyalties and political advantage. The civil war unfolded over 5 years, from 1527 to 1532, with battles concentrated in the northern and central highlands of Peru. Spanish chroniclers report that armies numbered in the tens of thousands, mobilized through the MITA system, and included troops drawn from both allies and resettled populations. Key engagements, such as the battles near Quito and Cajamarca, demonstrated the logistical sophistication and military organization inherited from earlier expansion phases, yet also exposed vulnerabilities in coordination, communication, and loyalty. The war had profound effects on imperial cohesion. Provincial governors were forced to choose sides, administrative networks were disrupted, and tribute and labor obligations suffered delays. Storehouses, fortresses, and road networks were repurposed for military needs, diminishing their economic and logistical functions. Archaeological evidence of temporary fortifications, battlefield debris, and abandoned administrative sites corroborates chronicler descriptions of disrupted imperial infrastructure. In addition to political and logistical disruption, the conflict had demographic and economic consequences. Mobilization drained local labor for agriculture and public works, contributing to reduced food production and local hardship. Resettled communities, Micmac, were caught between competing factions, experiencing displacement, requisitioning of goods, and conscription into opposing armies. These disruptions weakened the social integration that had previously maintained loyalty to the central authority of Cusco. The Civil War also influenced religious and ritual authority. Huáscar and Atahualpa both claimed legitimacy through control of sacred sites, temples, and royal mummies. The alignment of provincial priesthoods and ceremonial centers with one faction or another further fragmented imperial cohesion. Control over Coricancha and regional Huacas became both a symbol and practical tool of power, demonstrating how religious authority was inseparable from political and military control. Spanish chroniclers emphasize that the conflict left Tawantinsuyu militarily exhausted and politically divided. Atahualpa ultimately captured Huáscar in 1532, but the empire remained destabilized. Loyalties were uncertain, communication networks strained, and the administrative machinery that had sustained imperial expansion was weakened. This fragmentation created conditions in which foreign intervention could have disproportionate impact, as the empire's capacity to mount coordinated resistance was compromised. Despite the disruption, some administrative and military structures persisted. Local governors continued to collect tribute, manage labor, and maintain road networks where possible, while military garrisons remained in strategic locations. These residual systems allowed temporary stabilization, but they were insufficient to restore the centralized authority that had characterized the empire under Huayna Capac and Pachacuti. Archaeological evidence of partially maintained infrastructure, combined with historical accounts of local submission and resistance, illustrates this partial continuity amidst widespread instability. The Civil War underscores the vulnerability inherent in imperial overextension. Expansion had brought wealth, labor, and resources under central authority, but it also dispersed power, created regional loyalties, and complicated succession. When contested succession arose, the very systems that enabled imperial cohesion became mechanisms for division, illustrating how rapid growth can simultaneously empower and destabilize centralized states. By 1532, the Huáscar-Atahualpa conflict had fractured Tawantinsuyu, leaving the empire exposed both internally and externally. Administrative networks were compromised, military resources were divided, and the legitimacy of the Sapa Inca was contested across vast territories. These vulnerabilities set the stage for the arrival of a small foreign force that would exploit divisions and hasten the collapse of one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian empires in the Americas. This division coincided with foreign intrusion, as the Spanish conquest leveraged internal discord, military exhaustion, and administrative fragmentation to advance rapidly through the Andean highlands. Conquest exploited existing fracture. A small Spanish force encountered an empire already weakened by civil war, internal division, and administrative strain. In November 1532, Francisco Pizarro and his contingent of fewer than 200 men captured Atahualpa at Cajamarca, exploiting the disarray generated by the Huáscar-Atahualpa Civil War. The Inca forces, though numerically superior, were uncoordinated, and local loyalties were divided. Spanish chroniclers, including Cieza de Leon and Pedro Pizarro, report that Atahualpa's entourage was unprepared for the sudden ambush, illustrating how political fragmentation and overextension had undermined imperial defense. The capture of Atahualpa created an immediate power vacuum. Regional governors and military leaders, uncertain of central authority and wary of Spanish intentions, offered mixed responses. Some sought accommodation, others resisted. This fragmentation accelerated political disintegration, as communication delays, disrupted tribute networks, and divided loyalties prevented a coordinated imperial response. Archaeological evidence supports the rapid abandonment or repurposing of administrative centers, fortresses, and storehouses in multiple provinces, reflecting the empire's structural collapse. European-introduced disease compounded political vulnerability. Smallpox, introduced through contact with coastal expeditions, had already reached the highlands prior to Pizarro's arrival. Mortality among nobles, administrators, and commoners disrupted governance, weakened military mobilization, and reduced labor productivity. Contemporary accounts suggest that disease-induced mortality may have reached levels high enough to destabilize local tribute collection and resource distribution, amplifying the impact of the Civil War. Spanish conquest also relied on alliances with disaffected local groups. Former subjects of Huáscar, rival provinces, and peripheral communities leveraged Spanish support to settle scores or gain autonomy. These alliances magnified the military and psychological advantage of a small Spanish force. Indigenous auxiliaries provided crucial knowledge of terrain, troop movements, and local political dynamics, enabling Pizarro to navigate complex social landscapes and consolidate rapid territorial gains. The Spanish systematically dismantled Inca administrative and ritual structures. Cusco was occupied, temples and palaces were looted or repurposed, and the symbolic authority of the Sapa Inca was undermined. Despite these actions, archaeological and documentary evidence indicates that some provincial governance, labor networks, and ceremonial practices persisted. Local leaders continued to collect tribute and manage populations under Spanish oversight, suggesting partial continuity of imperial structures in altered form. The Inca military, already weakened by civil war, was unable to resist sustained campaigns. Fortifications and garrisons, while formidable, could not compensate for divided command and the combined effects of disease, desertion, and indigenous alliances with the Spanish. Rapid conquest of key cities and strategic regions effectively neutralized centralized military capacity, leaving peripheral provinces increasingly autonomous or compliant under Spanish authority. Economic and logistical systems, including storehouses, road networks, and Micmac communities, were disrupted or redirected to support Spanish occupation. Agricultural production continued locally, but surplus management and imperial redistribution ceased, undermining centralized provisioning. The disruption of labor obligations, both MITA and MITMAC, further diminished the coherence of the economic network that had sustained imperial administration. The collapse of Tawantinsuyu was not instantaneous but occurred over a few years, accelerated by the combination of civil war, disease, military defeat, and social fragmentation. Provincial governors, religious authorities, and local elites faced the dual pressures of Spanish imposition and internal realignment. Spanish chroniclers highlight the rapid submission of previously loyal provinces, illustrating how pre-existing fractures enabled conquest with minimal European manpower. Despite the dissolution of central authority, some administrative and social mechanisms persisted under Spanish control. Tributary systems, labor conscription, and certain ceremonial practices were adapted to colonial structures. These continuities facilitated Spanish exploitation while revealing the resilience of Inca organizational principles. Archaeological evidence of continued settlement patterns, local governance, and agricultural infrastructure underscores the partial survival of institutional frameworks even after imperial collapse. The conquest demonstrates how structural fragility, internal division, and demographic shocks intersected with European military technology to produce rapid political disintegration. Tawantinsuyu's centralized authority, once a source of cohesion, became a vulnerability when faced with simultaneous internal and external pressures. The interplay of civil war, disease, and foreign intervention underscores the complex dynamics behind the empire's collapse, highlighting that conquest was contingent as much on internal weakness as on external force. Imperial structures did not vanish entirely. Remnants of governance, labor organization, and ceremonial practice persisted, laying the groundwork for both colonial administration and the continued social memory of Inca authority in Andean communities. Empire ended, systems endured. While Tawantinsuyu fell politically, its social, economic, and infrastructural frameworks persisted under Spanish rule. Following the Spanish conquest, the administrative and logistical systems of the Inca Empire were repurposed to support colonial governance. The MITA labor system continued, though redirected toward Spanish economic objectives such as silver mining and agricultural estates. Indigenous communities were often obligated to provide labor for colonial projects, utilizing pre-existing organizational structures that had coordinated labor contributions across ALIS and provinces. Chroniclers and colonial records indicate that local authorities, including former Inca leaders, were sometimes co-opted as intermediaries, maintaining continuity of governance while serving new colonial hierarchies. In addition to labor, the extensive road network and infrastructure of Tawantinsuyu remained central to colonial administration. Roads, bridges, and way stations facilitated transport of goods, people, and information across the Andes, supporting both economic extraction and military logistics. Archaeological surveys confirm the ongoing use of Kapaknan segments during the colonial period, with adaptations for Spanish pack animals and cart traffic. The integration of Inca infrastructure into colonial systems illustrates the enduring functionality of imperial planning and the adaptability of Andean communities to new political realities. Religious and cultural adaptation was equally significant. Syncretism allowed traditional Andean beliefs, practices, and ritual observances to persist within a nominally Christian framework. Huacas, sacred mountains, and ancestral cults continued to hold local significance, often merged with Catholic saints and festivals. Spanish missionary reports and archaeological evidence indicate that indigenous communities maintained ritual cycles and ceremonial sites, reflecting continuity of spiritual and social norms. This adaptation reinforced social cohesion and preserved aspects of communal identity, even under colonial imposition. Colonial policies often relied on local intermediaries, including former Inca nobles and administrative specialists, to manage taxation, labor, and settlement organization. This practice not only facilitated Spanish control but also ensured the partial survival of Andean governance models. Mitmac communities, Alu divisions, and provincial hierarchies continued to influence local administration, providing continuity in population management and resource allocation. Chroniclers note that Spanish authorities frequently consulted indigenous leaders for guidance on labor allocation, crop cycles, and road maintenance. Economically, the persistence of agrarian systems, storage facilities, and regional specialization allowed Andean communities to adapt to new demands while maintaining traditional subsistence strategies. Terracing, irrigation channels, and highland-lowland exchanges continued to support food security, while local craft production and textile traditions were incorporated into colonial markets. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that many pre-existing storage facilities, culcas, and distribution centers were repurposed to supply Spanish settlements, highlighting the practical utility of Inca logistical systems. Despite political subjugation, cultural memory and identity remained robust. Oral traditions, genealogies, and ritual practices preserved knowledge of Inca governance, social organization, and cosmology. These practices informed local resistance, negotiation with colonial authorities, and community cohesion. Spanish accounts acknowledge the enduring influence of Inca descendants in shaping labor, ceremonial, and administrative arrangements, illustrating how cultural structures outlasted the collapse of political authority. The survival of Andean systems during colonial transformation underscores the resilience and adaptability of pre-Columbian structures. While Spanish rule reoriented labor, governance, and ritual toward colonial objectives, the underlying mechanisms of organization, communication, and social cohesion remained functional. This continuity facilitated both colonial administration and the preservation of indigenous identity, ensuring that aspects of Tawantinsuyu endured in modified forms. By maintaining roads, labor networks, administrative hierarchies, and ritual observances, Andean communities adapted strategically to foreign domination. The structural legacy of the Inca Empire thus persisted not as a political entity but as a set of functional, social, and cultural systems that shaped colonial governance and influenced subsequent generations. These enduring frameworks illustrate the deep integration of organizational, infrastructural, and ceremonial practices into the Andes, highlighting the long-term impact of Tawantinsuyu on regional history. Andean culture adapted, blending pre-Columbian practices with colonial structures, preserving identity, and transmitting knowledge that would influence post-colonial society and modern interpretations of Inca heritage. The Inca are known through evidence, not legend. Modern archaeology reveals the empire's structure, economy, and society beyond the narratives recorded by Spanish chroniclers. Systematic archaeological investigation has transformed understanding of the Inca Empire, challenging colonial and early post-colonial accounts that often emphasized conquest, brutality, or mythical origins. Excavations at Cusco, Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, and provincial centers provide tangible data on urban planning, architectural techniques, road construction, and labor organization. These sites confirm sophisticated engineering practices, including finely cut masonry, terracing, and integrated drainage, demonstrating the empire's capacity for centralized coordination and adaptation to diverse ecological zones. Studies of settlement patterns and rural infrastructure have clarified the role of the ALU and Mitmac systems in resource management. Surveying of agricultural terraces, storage facilities, culcas, and irrigation networks indicates a high degree of logistical planning, ensuring food security and supporting specialized labor. Archaeologists have used pollen analysis, isotopic studies, and faunal remains to reconstruct subsistence strategies, revealing the integration of highland and lowland production as well as reliance on camelid pastoralism and maize cultivation. Quipu analysis and ethno-historical cross-referencing have elucidated methods of accounting, census-taking, and administrative communication, providing evidence of complex record-keeping in the absence of writing. The distribution of quipus across provincial centers demonstrates both standardized protocols and regional adaptations, allowing historians to infer population sizes, labor obligations, and tribute collection with unprecedented precision. Reevaluation of Spanish chroniclers, such as Cieza de Leon, Garcilaso de la Vega, and Betanzos, in combination with archaeological data, has corrected earlier misconceptions. Many colonial narratives overemphasized conquest and violence while underreporting administrative sophistication, logistical planning, and cultural continuity. Modern scholarship places the Inca within a continuum of Andean state formation, recognizing the empire's reliance on pre-existing institutions, cosmology, and labor organization. Remote sensing, GIS mapping, and LiDAR technology have revealed previously unrecorded settlements, roads, and ceremonial sites, expanding the known geographic scope of Tawantinsuyu. These techniques have also clarified patterns of regional integration and control, demonstrating that provincial centers were strategically located to manage labor, resources, and communication. This evidence underlines the systematic and deliberate nature of Inca statecraft, countering interpretations that depict the empire as purely militaristic or opportunistic. Bioarchaeological research complements material evidence by providing insight into health, diet, and demographic trends. Skeletal analyses indicate variation in workload, nutrition, and mobility, reflecting the social stratification and labor organization within and between ALIS. Isotopic data reveal trade and exchange networks spanning ecological zones, confirming that imperial cohesion relied on both administrative oversight and ecological adaptation. Ethno-historical and ethnographic approaches further illuminate cultural practices, including ritual, kinship, and governance, demonstrating the continuity of Andean traditions even under Spanish colonial rule. Observations of surviving practices, combined with excavation data, allow scholars to reconstruct aspects of social organization, religious observance, and political structure that were omitted or misinterpreted in colonial texts. These interdisciplinary approaches have led to reinterpretation of Inca origins, expansion, and collapse, situating the empire as a product of millennia of Andean statecraft, rather than as an isolated phenomenon. The evidence supports a view of the Inca as pragmatic administrators, engineers, and integrators of diverse populations, rather than merely mythologized conquerors. This reframing emphasizes institutional continuity, adaptation to ecological diversity, and complex governance as defining characteristics. By grounding historical analysis in archaeological evidence and critical scholarship, researchers provide a balanced and nuanced understanding of Tawantinsuyu. Material remains, demographic data, and comparative studies offer a foundation for assessing social, political, and economic systems without over-reliance on post-conquest narratives. This evidence-based approach enables historians to differentiate between legend, colonial interpretation, and empirical fact. Historical assessment requires balance, integrating archaeological evidence, ethno-historical sources, and critical scholarship to evaluate the Inca Empire's achievements, challenges, and enduring influence on Andean societies. Before we close, make sure to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall history videos. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the Inca story fascinated you most? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these immersive, fact-driven historical documentaries straight to you.